So we are approaching the holiday of Shavuot, when Moses received the Ten Commandments, and this is an appropriate time to discuss Jewish heritage in Europe through the Ten Commandments for Jewish Heritage, which have been drawn up by the Rothschild Foundation. And we're going to focus in the next hour or so on 4 commandments. 1, thou shalt not treat every old, derelict synagogue as sacrosanct. 2, thou shalt draw on the stores of knowledge contained in Jewish cemeteries and be programmatic about their ongoing preservation. 6, thou shalt not make it cool to visit death camps. And finally, 10, thou shalt acknowledge and support the selfless individuals caring for Jewish heritage. We're fortunate to have 3 great speakers from all over Europe to help us discuss these issues. First, from Italy, Ruth Ellen Gruber, who has written and researched on Jewish heritage for more than 3 decades. And I'm really glad to have Ruth here. We met actually in the 1980s after the communist Polish government expelled her for her fearless journalism. And she now splits her time between Italy and Budapest. Our second speaker is from Warsaw, Helise Lieberman. She's the director of the Taub Center for the Renewal of Jewish Life. And she's an educator and former Hillel director who helped found the Lauder Marasha Day School in Warsaw and has been running since 2009 the Taub Jewish Heritage Tours. She's lived in Warsaw since 1994 and is a dual Polish and US citizen. And finally, from Barcelona, we have Victor Sorensen, director of the European Association for the Preservation and Promotion of Jewish Culture and Heritage since 2017. Victor partners with the EUPJ in the European Commission-sponsored Networks Overcoming Anti-Semitism project. So let's start right away. You can leave your questions in the chat box and I'll see them and ask them for you. I think that's better to keep the discussion flowing. We're going to start with the first commandment, which is thou shalt not treat every old derelict synagogue as sacrosanct. And Ruth, why don't you start by explaining what is meant by that commandment?
Okay, thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. And thanks for remembering how far back we go, which is quite a long time.
Yes.
When we were both doing other things. You know, the Center for Jewish Art in Jerusalem at Hebrew University was commissioned by the Foundation for Jewish Heritage in London to up a database of historic synagogues in Europe a couple of years ago. And it now is a website, historicsynagoguesofeurope.org, I believe. And they came up with more than 3,000, I believe 3,300 some synagogues that are still standing all over Europe. Only a small part of this number is used for services. Hundreds of them are in ruinous condition or very ruinous condition, abandoned or ruined. Hundreds more have been transformed for other use, and sometimes transformed totally out of recognition. There's no way to even know that these were synagogues except for research, which has been conducted. Some of them, however, are important spiritually, important historically, important architecturally, even if they're in bad condition. And on this website, the scholars who've drawn it up have sort of listed the synagogues or grouped them according to their condition, their importance locally, nationally, internationally, etc. I think a lot of these synagogues that have been transformed out of recognition and had not been, let's say, major buildings or important buildings, had just been small buildings to begin with, they don't need to be restored. They don't need, in many cases, to be saved. We want to save the buildings. We want to restore synagogues. We want to reuse the buildings. We want to reuse them in appropriate ways. But I think some of these buildings, I don't want to put it this way, but they may not be worth the effort. there are limited resources. In order to restore a building, you have to have funding, you have to know what it's going to be used for, and you have to have sustainability after the restoration. And I think funds and knowledge and wherewithal need to be really concentrated on these buildings. There are many ways that can be done. And many synagogues in the more than 30 years that I've been looking at these buildings have been restored. I mean, we can look at some pictures if you like. Yeah. And there's even, let's look at the picture for well, Shamorin.
Okay.
Okay, Shamorin is a small town near Bratislava in Slovakia. The synagogue there was built, no, that's Helm, that's Shamorin. The synagogue there, when I first saw it 30 years ago, was a ruin. It was built in around 1911, 1912. It has been restored, but in a way that preserves the damage. You can see that it's been damaged, so it tells the story of what's been done. Another synagogue that I don't think is, you can save at this point is Helm, which we just saw above that. Helm, the synagogue has been turned into a saloon, a Western style saloon, and virtually every aspect of what made it, or you could see that it made it a synagogue, has been removed. Inside there's a restaurant upstairs and a sort of saloon downstairs. Outside you can see the 10 Commandments. But what is important is on the outer part of the building, there is a plaque that gives the history of the building, that denotes it as a synagogue, and therefore its historic identity is retained. I mean, this is not the ideal solution, but at this point, I don't know what can be done with this building. Helm is a small town in southeast Poland, no Jews there, and this at least gives the identity. And then one more picture, Novi Korchin.
Let's see if we can
is another solution where
no,
that's been restored. Novi Korchin.
Here we are. Another
Novi Korchin, when I first saw it, was a total wreck, a ruin. And even the signs in the town said, to the ruined synagogue. It hasn't been restored, it's been now preserved as a ruin. And this is another solution for these buildings. Don't tear it down, don't reconstruct it, don't turn it into something else, but it can be preserved as a ruin which serves as a memorial. And now I believe there's some other plans for this building to make it more of a memorial something, but I'm not sure of the details. So those are just a few comments on that commandment.
Elise, since many of these examples seem to be in Poland, which how is this perceived in Poland, the prospect of restoring synagogues in provincial towns where there are no Jews left?
Well, first of all, thank you for including me. It's lovely to be here with you, Bill, and the EUPJ, and also with my Jewish Heritage Hard Talks team, Ruth and Victor. I would like to come at this from a different perspective rather than jumping off on what Ruth sort of laid out for us. And I think a couple of questions come up for me is, who are the stakeholders? Is there an international or a national connection? What does it mean to the town? Does it mean something to the municipality or the region? Am I, let's say, as someone who has roots in Novi Korchin, come back and say, I'm ready to participate, and in what am I participating? So the question that we raise, in addition to those great questions of restoration, preservation, for whom, by whom, is who's really committed, and Ruth said it very clearly, the sustainability of such a project. And that requires the scaffolding of education. And that requires scaffolding of education locally, but also for those, and Victor and Ruth and I are all involved in educational heritage programming. And that's we need to start a dialogue. We know that parachuting down from outside and saying, we have to do this. My favorite question is, why don't you take care of, don't you? I don't know who the you is. I don't know, Ruth, Victor. It may be me as a Polish American Jew. It might be the Polish government. It might be the Chief Rabbi's Office of Poland. But you need a consortium sometimes of people who are both academic and in the field who feel it. to come to some kind of agreement, and what might that agreement be? For me, we should take it as the jumping off point for just these kind of conversations with this generation of people who, for them, the synagogue is a stone, and it might be somehow, but it's not in their I would say their cartography of memory at all. And the question is, how can a conversation about a synagogue, which indeed is not sacrosanct, how can that stimulate some kind of recognition of the past and what one does with it to make it part of the present?
And taking that, Victor, from Barcelona, where there are fewer, I guess, in Spain since 1492, fewer actual buildings than in Poland, but how do you see restoring synagogues and making them into memorials or testaments to a history, or keeping them active in the present?
Well, first of all, thank you, Bill, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share this space with you and with my colleagues Ruth and Elise. And I must confess that for me, they are my references. So it's a great honor to be seated here with all of you. Regarding your question, I would like to approach it through a complementary perspective from what Ruth and Elise they were saying, no? Because the mainstream recovery of Jewish history and culture can be used also as a means of rethinking and redefining both personal identities and national histories, and in a process that it's both conscious and unconscious. And Jews themselves, we have not been immune to this phenomenon. So I think that it's an incredible opportunity for communities, cities, municipalities to use Jewish heritage as an entry point for public understanding of the past, but also the continuities and evolution of Jewishness as still articulated in the present. For me, it's very important that Jewish heritage is not presented just as a picture of the past. It needs to talk about also the present nowadays. Parallel to this development of also non-Jewish embracing Jewish things in Europe, there has been an internal Jewish rediscovery of roots and heritage too, particularly since the fall of communism, as Ruth was pointing out. The embrace of Jewish culture by mainstream society has gone side by side with effort by Jews to recover or redefine personal Jewish identities and to revive or enrich Jewish communities, Jewish life, and Jewish culture. And I think that this is a very interesting process because narratives are changing, are evolving. And this heritagization of past, Jewish life and culture can respond to expectations and cultural demands by non-Jews, and can also feed business and tourism products and the destination diversification. However, approaching this heritage without a connection with a living and evolving Jewish dimension raises issues of cultural authenticity, interethnic dialogue, community participation, and history interpretation. No? The question of what we are offering in these spaces. No.
Ruth, if you were going to take you mentioned 3,300 synagogues. How many could be saved, should be saved, in your opinion, if we were going to follow the first commandment? And who owns these buildings now, and who decides? I know that for our movement, for example, it is often difficult to get access to these historic synagogues. Should the ownership, or should it be parceled out a little more equitably, perhaps, or are these places where there are just no Jews left to use the synagogues?
Well,
a lot of questions, I know.
It depends on where you are. It depends on where you are. In World War II, the Holocaust, even before, starting with Kristallnacht, 1938, there was a massive destruction of Jewish-built heritage, synagogues, Jewish cemeteries, et cetera, et cetera. So there were many, many destroyed. Hundreds, if not thousands, were destroyed. In one town I can think of, in Iași, in Romania, there are 2 standing synagogues now, and there used to be 100. One of the synagogues has been beautifully restored. There's a teeny tiny Jewish community there. The other, last I knew, had not been restored. It was used as some sort of storage place. So after the Holocaust, in much of Europe, Jews didn't live. There weren't Jews living there anymore. In the provincial Hungary, there weren't any Jews. Much of Romania, tiny communities, or Poland, almost no Jews. And in these places, what struck me as being really impressive when I first started looking at these things, more than 30 years ago, was in these communist countries, there were no Jews there. So the Jewish built heritage was disregarded. It was as if it didn't mean anything. It's if it had no value because the Jews weren't there. So, it didn't. And some of them had been taken over by the cities, by the municipalities, by the region, by private individuals. Some of them were just left to stand ruined in the middle of towns because nobody cared. It's a different situation in countries where there is an active, or has been always an active Jewish community. Synagogues have been used continuously. However, in some countries like England, just like in the United States, synagogues, even big synagogues, even beautiful synagogues, are being closed and abandoned because of dwindling congregations and demographic shifts. People are leaving neighborhoods and moving into other neighborhoods. So there's a complex dynamic of who owns what and who's responsible for them. There was a case recently in Glasgow where a synagogue has been standing empty because the congregation dwindled and they left it. A new startup congregation, like a progressive congregation, radical progressive congregation, wanted to take it over, wanted to get it for their use, but they wanted the synagogue was up for sale for a huge sum of money, like £600,000, I believe, and it didn't sell. They wanted to sell it for office space or something like that, to get money. There was a case also in England in another seaside town where the congregation was selling the synagogue because they couldn't keep it up anymore. But there was a popular movement, a civic movement, to try to save the synagogue and not use it as business development or housing or apartments or something, but to use it as a cultural center. And they found a benefactor who was able to help them do this. It was taken off the auction block and they got hold of it. So it depends on a lot of these aspects, a lot of these dynamics. And in countries like Poland or Ukraine or Belarus, where after the Holocaust, this communist state wanted nothing to do with these buildings by and large. Many of them are ruins or transformed. If a synagogue is returned to a Jewish community through restitution, who has the money to restore it? These questions are all there. So it depends on where you are, basically, and it depends on a lot of things.
Victor, Elise, also, how do you feel then if you get the situation like in Poland where the synagogue in a city where there's no Jews left is turned into a saloon? Do you think that's a proper reuse of the building, or because it saved the building, or is it regrettable that it's getting to a very, very different use than the original spiritual meaning of it?
Victor?
Elise, maybe you can answer first. Yeah, because it's a Polish.
Well, I want to say this is, you asked me, I'm speaking personally, if I might, because there are a lot of people who are working on these very issues, Victor and Ruth, and probably Bill, who some of those players are, including the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland, different municipalities. But there are two things. One, if I may, one is also, again, to jump off of what Ruth said about coming, in terms of communism. If the idea was to make a kind of monolithic ism, then Judaism and any heritage was left out. I think we also have to remember, and you all know better, but after the war, there were people to feed and people to house and people to sleep and people to take care of, and buildings that may no longer seem to be important, which they weren't. I mean, they were important, but not for the people because they weren't there, become derelict. So I would say the glimmer of hope there's a lot of them, and we'll talk about them when we come to another one of our commandments that we're talking about today, is that there are people who are ready to take it on, if at least try to say this building has some spiritual value. I think, Bill, you mentioned it. It's like, what is the value? And Victor too. I mean, is a synagogue that's a saloon? To me, it seems inappropriate. The plaque is very nice. Now, does the plaque lead to more questions? Does it engage the people who are looking? That's the big question. And to me, is it better that it's standing as a saloon or not standing? I think that's a great question to ask anybody in the field, because it resonates more with your neshama, your soul, I think, than even in terms of a heritage site. So the good news is that people are curious and people are concerned. And interestingly enough, that it's the generation of people who fought on the barricades of solidarity. It's some of those people in, I would say, our generation, Ruth, I don't know about Bill and Victor, but who have revived Polish Jewish culture, for example, as a festival. And those are also scaffoldings that help people think about what else is out there. Yes, I can sing and I can get through music, but wait a minute, where are the roots of this culture that you would like me to at least acknowledge? So
fair enough. And Victor, I mean, we have a question from Magda Rubenfeld about an example in Krakow, where there is a Jewish community, there are working synagogues, and yet one synagogue has been, which is owned by a Jewish community, has been turned into a discotheque. Yes. I believe that's the right situation. Victor, how do you feel about that reuse? Saloon, discotheque, should it be forbidden or encouraged?
Well, if the dilemma is saloon or discotheque, I think that both answers are worse. I will not say that this is the correct path. What I find interesting is the process on how we arrive to that stage, no? And generally speaking, and here I will refer what Elise was saying, in this process, there's many stakeholders that needs to be involved. It's not a guarantee that there's just the Jewish community behind, and if it's even worse if the Jewish community is not involved in the whole process. I understand that this intersection between different actors that probably have different agendas and interests, it's hard. But I think that the trend in heritage management, and not specifically Jewish heritage management, but heritage management in general, it's pointing out to this intersectionality, being able to sit at the same table, the local community, the local Jewish community, public agents, and so on, like the key actors in that. We are talking about discussion. We are talking about negotiating, and I think that some like these examples, maybe they are not can be featured as best practice also in this process behind it.
Okay. Before we move on, there's a last question about synagogues, Ruth, and then we'll move on to cemeteries from Judy Patterson about abandoned synagogues in Belarus that are being offered for sale at a very low price. I think it's $5,000, with the condition that the investor renovate the building. Is this a viable approach, do you think, Ruth? And why or why not?
Okay, frankly, I know of three synagogues in the past year that have gone up for auction in Belarus. One of them in Slonim is a historic synagogue and one of the best preserved, very architecturally important, very beautiful, and it has been the focus of attempts to restore it for over 25 years. It was on the World Monuments Fund watch back in the 90s, I believe, and the Foundation for Jewish Heritage has had an interest in it. It was up for auction. And finally, this past year, it was bought at auction for about $6,000, I think, by a writer and musician who lives in Minsk. But she has been in touch with a lot of international bodies and experts about how to restore this. It's going to take a huge amount of money, a huge amount of expertise, and the conditions that the municipality, which was the owner, I believe it was the municipality was the owner, put on the sale is that everything has to be done within 5 years. And it's an incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive and incredibly, overwhelming project to be completed in 5 years, especially as this owner has no sort of history in Jewish heritage preservation or in preservation whatsoever. But I know that she's very active, and I think she's set up a foundation to work on this. The other two synagogues that were up for auction for very little money are two of the ones that for me maybe aren't worth it, frankly. They're both in small villages, small remote villages. I don't want to say in the middle of nowhere, but fairly remote villages, very small. Both, as I understand from looking at the pictures, had their interiors gutted, and they were used for decades as local culture centers or something like that. They're not architecturally important buildings. There's no Jewish community there. It would take a lot of money to restore them, and then you have to ask for what? What would they be restored for? Whom would they be restored for? I think that these two buildings, as far as I know from what I've read about them and the pictures I've seen about them and all this, these are two of the buildings where it would be much better to concentrate the resources and the wherewithal and the intensity of action and desire into helping preserve the great synagogue in Slonim, which has meaning, which has a lot of meaning, both for Jews in Belarus, Jews in Slonim, where there are some Jews still, and internationally. There's another synagogue in Belarus. It hasn't been up for auction, but they're also trying, it's an important building with beautiful frescoes in Ashmiani. That too is somewhere where resources, the scarce resources that we have, can be put in trying to save and restore that building, rather than two remote buildings that are not architecturally important, that don't seem to have much Jewish historical importance, and are very remote, and the constituency is debatable. So there are projects where I would concentrate on where possible.
Makes sense to me, and it's interesting. Let's move on to cemeteries. Obviously, Ruth, is it the same sort of challenge as with synagogues, or is there a different dynamic at work?
Well, there's a big difference in the dynamic at work, because synagogues in themselves are not holy. Cemeteries in themselves are basically sacred spaces. They are sacred. You can have a synagogue in your living room if you have a Torah and then read the Torah there. And in fact, I have gone to services in a synagogue in somebody's living room. But a cemetery is always a cemetery. When you read, things where they talk about former Jewish, they're not former cemeteries, even if there are no headstones there. If people are buried there, they are cemeteries, and they are sacred spaces. So it's a different dynamic, very much so. And another difference is there are many, 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 many more of them. There may be 10 or 11,000 cemeteries in Europe. Many of them, hundreds, thousands of them, are abandoned, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe too. In the United States, there are Jewish cemeteries that are in terrible condition and overwhelmed. A wet season will give you foliage and growth and weeds that completely can engulf a cemetery. They need constant care, and they need regular maintenance, and they need restoration. But if you can there, and what we can learn from these cemeteries, these are some headstones in Eastern Europe where you can learn from the epitaphs, you can learn from the art, you can learn from the placement and all of this. And so these are repositories of knowledge. They're stone knowledge. I want to make just one comment, then the others should talk. The Holocaust generation, the people who survived the Holocaust, are passing away, unfortunately. But these places, these built places, the cemeteries, abandoned as they are, the synagogues, ruined or transformed, whatever, they too are survivors. And they tell stories. They have stories to tell. And the cemeteries perhaps have more stories to tell than the synagogues, because they have the epitaphs, they have the iconography, they have the art, they have the numbers. And it's very important, the documentation that goes on and the mapping and the survey, so that we get this documentation before it erodes, because it's eroding.
No, and of the 11,000 or so cemeteries, I mean, there was a question, I think, in particular about Lvov and Babi Yar. I mean, are there particular ones that are endangered, and we should pay particular attention to restoring them?
There are many that are endangered. There are many that are endangered.
Right, and the particular,
many
the Lvov and
many.
Babi Yar were the two which our questioner asks.
Well, Babi Yar I can't speak to, but in Lvov, there's in Lvov, the cemetery, the old cemetery has been built over. Many cemeteries in Europe, in Eastern Europe, were built over, where their headstones were taken away and used for construction work by the Nazis, but also afterwards. They were destroyed like this. In Lviv, the old cemetery was built over by a huge big marketplace, and there's only a small section left. So this needs to be preserved. And I was on the jury of an international competition for a memorial site there, which we chose, which memorial we thought would fit. It's the part that but this has been a debate that's been going on for decades now about what to do about this enormous open market that's built on top of the cemetery. But it's not the only place where cemeteries have been built over. I mean, in Barcelona, you have an example, right, Victor?
Right.
I mean, tell us a little bit about the Barcelona example, or I mean, the Jewish cemeteries in Spain, they must be from before 1492, most of them, right?
Yes, exactly. I think that if we, I believe that depending on the region of Europe, the challenges are very different. Maybe I'm more familiar with this western side of Europe, no? And for example, here in Spain, regarding Jewish cemeteries, and I'm referring to the medieval ones, they are at a very complex crossroad between epigraphy, archaeology, and conservation. Much of the epigraphic evidence has been contextualized when medieval Jewish tombstones have been uprooted and reused as building material. And in Barcelona, we can see that as a perfect example. We can find tombstones all around the center of the city. But I will also like to point out another controversy.
Victor, what has happened in Barcelona? What should be done to preserve, and what can be preserved in Barcelona?
The situation in Barcelona is as follows. For the ones that have visited the city, in Barcelona, we find a small mountain called Montjuïc. Nowadays, we can find there the Olympic Stadium, the Miró Museum, and it's a great cultural area. The thing is that the medieval Jewish cemetery, it was located there, and actually the name Montjuïc, it refers to Mount of the Jews. First, the archaeological research had been stopped because there was disputation between Jewish actors from the Jewish communities and the municipality. But not just that, we find that there's even another harder question, is that a lot of Jewish tombstones, they were reused for building purposes from the 16th and 17th centuries. So we find it all around the city as bricks. And that's not just a terrible and dramatic thing. The most terrible aspect for me is that we cannot find any explanation, any context for these tombstones. Also, there's the question of if we are able or not to make archaeological research on these medieval cemeteries. And there's a tendency nowadays that actually came or arrived from Israel, that is the influence of some religious tendencies within the Jewish community in these kinds of work. And public authorities are not very aware of particularities of Judaism, and not being well informed, they tend to consider Jews as a special community governed by its own internal rules. They are therefore sensitive to international pressures exerted on their own territory. So they are creating a good mess. We can talk about religious continuity versus cultural heritage. No? The first claims to defend a special right, the others defend the general interest. So I think that it's a very, very complex process, and we are just starting. And I know that it's not just, this is not just happening in Spain, also in different regions where we found a large number of Jewish cemeteries from the Middle Ages.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question from Sonia Guntner, our chairwoman. If possible, can participants share their thoughts on the fact that many Jewish cemeteries in Western Europe are nowadays closed or under the control of secular authorities, such as the municipal park departments in some cases? And for us as progressive Jews, many of them are closed to us. What could be done to improve that that situation so that Jews can find access to cemeteries? Elise, do you?
I don't know what you mean by
Ruth.
Ruth, okay. Ruth has the big picture view.
No,
there.
I'm not sure what you mean by Jewish cemeteries are closed.
Well, they're run by the Orthodox communities so that they're not open to progressive Jews.
Okay, what I understood was that you're not allowed to visit them, but you can visit cemeteries.
No, not just to visit, but to be buried there.
Okay, I think that you have to work it. I think you have to work it out with the local community. I mean, in some countries you have Reform and you have Orthodox. In some countries you have a section in one cemetery. You know, you have a cemetery with sections in it. I don't think you can generalize that Jewish cemeteries in Western Europe are closed. But I think, you know, where someone is going to be buried, you know, there's a lot of, in Hungary, you know, there was a huge scandal because in the nail log, which is the non-Orthodox cemetery, there was a huge corruption scandal because they were charging, you know, huge sums of money to bury you. I mean, I can't remember exactly the details now, but it was this huge scandal because there was corruption in the administration. Well, corruption is everywhere, but there's cases, for example, in Warsaw's Okapowa Street Cemetery. There's a recent case where a non-Jewish man who's very close with Jewish heritage was allowed to be buried there. And there are the non-Jewish spouses of some Jews are buried there. So it's up to Jews to work this out amongst themselves. I don't think a municipal cemetery is a municipal cemetery, but I think it's for locals to work it out. I don't think there's any overarching rule for this. It would be the same overarching rule
from our perspective. The main thing was most of this heritage was given back to Orthodox communities, even if it was originally with progressive communities, and is kept with Orthodox communities who control it. So do you think that needs to be changed in any which way?
Well, if may I, Bill, I think that again, it's how we are structuring this process. We have seen how difficult it is, the work and the understanding between the Jewish community as a whole and the public authorities. No? This debate about continuity of religion and national interest, to call it in some form. I'm very familiar with this dispute because I was serving as director of the Jewish community in Barcelona. I was working for the progressive synagogue here. So I'm aware that there's a very important debate that needs to be put on the table. And in this sense, there is engagement between progressive communities, conservative, Orthodox. They also need to talk to each other. They need to be seated at the same table, because heritage doesn't understand about affiliation. It's a shared heritage that it also doesn't understand about borders. So I really think that we are missing also from on the side of the Jewish communities to trigger and to offer these discussions and these debates within the Jewish community.
Okay. And Elise, before we move on, what is happening in your neck of Europe, where there probably are the most cemeteries? Are they in particular danger in Poland, or are they being now, is there a movement to really restore, at least keep them, preserve them?
I'm full disclosure, it's not my area of expertise, but
Okay.
I would share the following, a couple of pieces, and I really want to thank Victor and Ruth for really shining a light on several of these issues. Especially, first of all, I understand there's between at least 1,200, 1,400 Jewish cemeteries in what is now Poland. And we know that there are several issues. Some of them are political, and some of them are financial, and some of them are recognizing, as Ruth pointed out, a cemetery is always a cemetery. There's no such thing as former. And not everybody, by the way, has bad intentions when they decide to build something on an empty plot of land. Now, what happens now, I think, certainly since 1989, and I'm going to speak about Warsaw. I don't want to address other cities because they all have their own complexities and are of equal importance, but we are lucky in Warsaw because two of the cemeteries, the old one in Brudno and the newer one on Okopowa that Ruth mentioned, survived the war. Now, Brudno not in such good shape, but funds have been dedicated. And I know people, young people who were taught to read inscriptions, and as Ruth and Victor point out, heritage knows no boundaries. We have our own internal boundaries or communal that we need to deal with, and that's clearly an issue that's coming out here. But also it's a sense of how do you teach people to retrieve heritage? One is finding it at the zoo. You find a matseva, a gravestone at the zoo, and someone says, oh my God, why, how did it get there? Okay, but what are we going to do with it? Where is it going to go? And what does it mean? And how do I read it? So the question is, educational heritage. Can I read a matseva? Do I know what those symbols mean? Why are those ways, as Ruth said, cemeteries narrate the story of a community? And I mean, for me, I don't know, you've been here. If you know, there are 5 or 6 places they say you have to go when you come to visit Jewish Warsaw. And if you don't go to Okopowa, it's like the Passover Seder. You have to do 2 or 3 things, and then you can say, I did it. You have to go to Okopowa Cemetery, and you have to look at the history, and you have to see how those tombstones, which fortunately many survived, they tell the story of who we are as Warsawian Jews. I've been in the office of the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Schurik, when he's on 16 phones, you know, with calls from developers who would like to build a cemetery, build a shopping mall. And we talked about the politics, we talked about Jewish communal interests, but we also talk about people who have business interests, who have a desire, this is a desirable space, and how do you convey it? I think one of the most meaningful teaching moments I had is to explain to people in a country which is predominantly not Jewish, that a cemetery is always a cemetery. And that value is really important when you're discussing the sanctity of a space. So, yes. Okay. Are people working on it? Yes. Do we need more funding? Yes. Do we need more shovels and picks and people? I mean, there are many, many many private groups that actually come to visit, or they're local, who clean cemeteries, who take care of them, who find funding to fence it. And also, again, here comes the conversation and the connection with those Polish Jews or Jews from anywhere who've gone, left, and when they come back, how can they help restore the heritage of what was once their family and their family town?
Okay, let's move on to a even more fraught question, which are the death camps. How should they be memorialized? The commandment is, "Thou shalt not make it cool to visit death camps." Ruth, is this a danger? Are they becoming cool to visit?
It depends on your definition of cool. I mean, I think if cool means important, if cool means interesting, if cool means something that you need to do.
I suspect it's
Or
meant
if
to
that,
be
then
sort of
yes,
like
but
not with that serious an intonation, but go on and explain what the challenge is here.
okay, the challenges are the challenge, I think, mainly regards the death camps like Auschwitz in Poland and Terezin in Czech Republic, which are major tourism and educational places, attractions. You know, before the pandemic, Auschwitz was receiving something like 2.5 million visitors a year. 2.5 million visitors a year. It's one of the major attractions in Poland. This picture here is a school group visiting Terezin in Czech Republic, and these kids are more interested in doing something else other than seeing a monument. It's because they're kids, but they are taking there as an educational experience. At Auschwitz, it's a place where you have to go. I led a Jewish heritage tour. Here's one of these being cool. A girl posing in front of the entry to Birkenau and having her friend take a nice picture of her. I mean, I think this is what cool in the sense that Sally meant in these commandments meant. It's not a place where you display yourself. It's not an Instagram background. Although I have to say, when I went to Belzec, I mean, I was moved to take a selfie there with a colleague of mine, because we wanted to immortalize ourselves being in this place. But the challenge comes with Auschwitz right now, where you get so many people. When I first was going there, you could wander around by yourself, you could visit, you could contemplate, you could be alone. But nowadays, so many people are there that they have had to put restrictions on how you can visit. You can, after 10 o'clock in the morning, you can only go with a group tour. If you go beforehand, like at 7 in the morning when it opens, you can go alone and spend time alone and see things by yourself. But otherwise, you have to go there. There are security issues. You cannot take a backpack in there anymore. You have to put everything in, if not in a locker, you have to leave them on the bus or something like that. You also get these school groups and these like March of the Living groups who go in. One of the most disturbing things I ever saw at Birkenau was a teenage kid wrapped in an Israeli flag pissing against the barrack in Birkenau. I mean, this was awful to me, because for one thing, I could see that he was coming in feeling like, you know, we are the Jews, we survived, we can do anything here. But he was desecrating what actually is a holy site in a way. And there's all of these dynamics going on. But the fact is that people want to go to Auschwitz. It's a place to go because it is the symbol of the Holocaust. And the administration there, for one, they have an excellent website which has, you know, hundreds of thousands of hits all the time, and Instagram and all of this. They have virtual tours. They're trying to deal with this huge amount with a physical place which is threatened by age and all of this. If when I tell people if they want to go to, I was going to say, I led a Jewish heritage tour about 5 years ago to Poland, and I didn't put Auschwitz on the itinerary because it was going to be about Jewish life. But everybody on the tour wanted to go to Auschwitz because that's where you have to go. But I tell people if they want to go somewhere, they should go to Belzec, which is another death camp, which has an extraordinary memorial where you feel everything, and nobody goes there. It's out of the way. It's not easy to get to, but the power of the place is like when I first was visiting Auschwitz. The power of the place is not people taking funny pictures in front of that for Instagram. The power of the place is intense. You cannot go to Belzec without feeling the impact of the horror. This is Belzec here. And this is, since 2004 has been this monument, but it's not easy to get to, so people don't go there. So I think that's part of the issue, is that you have a site of mass, if not tourism, mass visiting. And that tends to make it into a crowd rather than or it can make it into like a very crowded, noisy experience rather than one that you want to contemplate, you want to go, you want to spend time. But it's a factor because it gets so many visitors. And what's better, to have a lot of visitors, to have no visitors? I don't know. It's like that.
It's a hard question. Victor, how does your organization deal with this dilemma, should we call it?
Well, I would say that in our case, the EUPJ is not focused on the works of memory and Holocaust in our work in the field of Jewish heritage, because we understand that there's already institutions with the expertise on this particular chapter of history. I think that in some way, as Sally stated in the article, I think that it needs to be handled sensitively, and places within a context. It has a lot of educational value, and maybe Elise, that has a more expertise in this particular area, especially in the educational approach to Holocaust, can elaborate a bit more, and maybe then I can talk about some reflections on the issue of memory, but more in the context. But maybe here, Elise, would you like to?
Elise, since at the risk of running into the Polish Holocaust law, since most or many of the death camps are located in Poland, modern day Poland, how is the Polish government, and how do you think they should be?
If you don't mind, I would like to address the commandment itself, permit me some commentary. Obviously, Jewish Heritage Heart Talks, it's all about the commentary, and Judaism is all about the commentary. But I think not only not cool, but one should not make it that you don't have to go to visit Auschwitz. It's not a pilgrimage you have to make as a Jew. I do believe if you want to go to Auschwitz, or you want to go to Belgium, you want to go to Trezen, that we should go, and we should make it possible to go so people have connection, that they are engaged, that they have time to reflect, and they are somehow involved in the process of memory. Auschwitz is not the Holocaust, but it has become, as Ruth said, the iconic symbol of the Holocaust. There are so many other pieces of it that we cannot neglect if we're talking about Jewish memory, about the war and the Shoah. But I think one of the issues that I'm struggling with, as someone who's taken many groups to Auschwitz and Birkenau to Belzec, and you're absolutely right, Ruth, I don't think I have ever felt completely stunned into silence for hours after my visit to Belzec. Maybe I went with a small group. I went with people who were open to, just being there. But I think what's really important is, in this year of this horrible year, these places have been allowed, unfortunately or fortunately, to rest. They need rest. Memorial sites need rest. And what I believe we need to do, if we have the capability, is think about how we approach them when they can be visited again. Who are we taking? Why are we taking them? How are we preparing them? This is not a checklist. I went to 6 death camps, 3 former ghettos, and a memorial. Poland is not an outdoor Holocaust memorial. Poland is a country which unfortunately has in its borders the 6 death camps left by the German Nazi regime. So in some senses, we are stakeholders in how it's visited. There are a lot of political issues which I don't want to get into, but I'm talking about how we as Jews may do well to think about how do our teenagers come? How do our 8th graders come? How do our March of the Living groups come? How do I come with a family of survivors? All of those sensitivities are extraordinarily important. So I believe that mapping our relationship with memorial sites is extremely important. I would just say, if I may, and I think this question will deserve another, at least all of the questions deserve at least their own time on a hard talk, but this is a time for us to think as religious leaders, as educators, as people in preservation, as people who are children now and grandchildren and almost great grandchildren of survivors, and how we negotiate with governments who may have another agenda. So that's it. And I just, if I may, we just commemorated the 78th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And for some of you who know on the call, who've been to Warsaw, Ruth, Victor, and Bill, you know, there are many monuments, but the one we talk about is the monument. And it's the Rappaport monument that was put up amongst the rubble in 1948. And we generally, ceremonies take place in the part of the monument where the figures are being shown and portrayed. But there are 2 sides of the monument, not a back and a front. And every memorial has to be displayed and entered and engaged with, understanding that there are multiple sides and one does not necessarily dominate the other. And if we're going to create a sense of memorialization, the context is important. Context is important.
We're getting towards the end, but I don't want to skimp on the last, which I think last commandment we're going to discuss, which is thou shalt acknowledge and support the selfless individuals caring for Jewish heritage. Ruth, could you tell us what that is meant? And I think we have some pictures of some of these individuals and what the challenge is to support them.
Yeah, I probably should defer to Helise to talk about Jan Jagielski.
Okay.
Would you like to, Helise? I mean, Jan, we lost a lot of these people this year. We lost people who started, non-Jewish people who started caring for Jewish heritage back in the 60s and 70s, even before. We lost Jan Jagielski, who died aged 83. He was one of the pioneers in the documentation of Jewish cemeteries and other places in Poland. We lost Maria Piachotka, who died at the age of 100. She and her late husband documented the wooden synagogues and the masonry synagogues. They were the experts in this, and they were instrumental in inspiring so many people. Jiří Fiedler and his wife were murdered about 6 or 7 years ago in their home in Prague by a guy who gained entry to their apartment by pretending that he wanted information about Jewish cemeteries, because Jiří was one of the pioneers of documenting Jewish heritage in Czechoslovakia, actually, in the communist years, where he would go out on his bicycle with old maps, trying to find places that were totally forgotten and to document them. There are hundreds of people like this all over Central and Eastern Europe. And many of them have been honored by awards. There's an award that was started in Poland in 1998 that has honored around 300 people already. There's the Pauline Award, there's the Sendler Award, there's the Leaders of Dialogue movement that has dozens of people in it that work on Jewish heritage. And they are inspirations for all of us. And sometimes they work in total disassociation with the Jewish communities. But I'd like, Helise is in Warsaw, she can talk about people there.
Elise, what was the
I think they talk
motivation of
about Jan and his legacy.
many of these individuals, non-Jewish, to preserve Jewish heritage?
I would say that's a very important question that you have to ask them. I mean, I think that the people I've had the pleasure and honor and working with, like Jan Jagielski, because he worked in the Jewish Historical Institute across from, or we are across from the office, the Toby Center is there. And I just wanted to say quickly, Ruth really described it. The people, I think we have to look, there are people at all levels of Jewish life, all pieces of it. Some are in the past and some are in the present. We are a group, and I find it absolutely, I can't imagine not working this way, of Jews and non-Jews all in it together. Meaning that there are, I mean, my staff is sort of dimensional, multifaceted, multi-creative, and we come from different backgrounds. And I think that, especially here in Poland, people say, what's the motivation? And I take your question with all due respect. Some people don't ask that question in such a way, and that's why I think, thank you for doing it. I think the reasons are multifold. You know, some people say, I do it because I should do it because this is part of my town. I mean, they really feel a connection to their heritage, and they feel that the lack of Jewish heritage being visible or engageable is bad. There are people who feel that Jewish life in Polish life without Jewish life is void. There's a void. There are people who do it because they find this interaction stimulating, and it's good for everyone around the table. Like Victor was saying, you know, stakeholders. There's nobody I know who does it for any glory or any money. And the awards, I'm very proud that the Toby Foundation has the Irene Sendler Award every year, who acknowledges Jews in different, non-Jews, I should say, in different fields, who give to Polish Jewish heritage. So I think it's a phenomenon we have to applaud. These are people that should be recognized. These are people who should be acknowledged, and they are one of the major stakeholders of at the preservation table.
Mm-hmm. Ruth, I noticed, and Elise, I noticed that most of the examples you've given are in former communist Central Europe. Victor, are there the same phenomenon here in Western Europe?
Absolutely, absolutely. Maybe there's
some examples.
What I would like to say is that beyond the existence of these figures, and as Elise and Ruth were saying, we need to acknowledge and recognize these efforts and works. I think that there's another interesting aspect to take into account. This recognition needs to be not just in the practical way, but also theoretical, in the sense that it's not just a best practice. The thing that it's the local community, the one that it's looking after, or efforts of individuals looking after of a heritage that it's shared, because at the end of the day, Jewish heritage in Poland, it's also Polish heritage, it's also European heritage. I think that we need to acknowledge that nowadays in the heritage management, these figures need to be counted as actor players. This is not just a work for specialists. We need to rely also in those figures that at the end of the day, they are projecting an incredible value of respect for the diversity, of commitment with this heritage, and also for the citizen involvement in these kinds of projects. So I think that that's something to take into account. And it's not just, okay, we need to acknowledge this group of people. It's no, we need to bring them to the table.
Bill, if I could just riff on Victor. I want to add, thank you, Victor. That was really well said. And I want to say that some of these people are those we don't see. They're in the classroom. They're on a city council. They are, they have the key to the cemetery because nobody else wants to hold it, and you have to go knock on their door, and they're not asking. I think that the other piece of this is they deserve our support. not just acknowledgement, but real support, because some of these people are doing on the front line that they're the only people. And they don't have an organization behind them, and there are people who are not exactly excited maybe about some of the things they're teaching, or some of the issues they're bringing into the city or the region. So I think that's important to add to what Ruth and Victor have said about the fact that this is also very much part of non-material heritage that they're taking responsibility for, not immaterial, non-material.
Ruth, you mentioned most of it's a older generation who are dying out. Are there replacements for these individuals to continue that work, or is it hard to recruit younger people?
No, it's growing. As far as I know, there are many young people. There are people who have been in. I said that we've lost some of these pioneers this year who were involved for decades.
Right.
And there are many young people who are stepping in, who are stepping up, and they come from many directions. Some of them were the students or the mentees of these older people. Others are discovering their own heritage in their hometown, as Elise said. Others are working in museums. I mean, in Germany, there are many, many non-Jewish people who deal with Jewish heritage, who create museums, who work in museums, who take care of cemeteries and all of that. Of course, Germany is a slightly different, or more than slightly different case, but there are younger generations who are stepping up and who are being connected with each other through the internet now. I mean, social media now has an incredible reach, and you find it easy to connect local people on the ground with descendants communities abroad in the United States and Israel. Many Jewish heritage sites or many towns have Facebook groups that deal specifically with these issues, and so there's new connection through the social media and through the internet that didn't exist 20 years ago.
Interesting. Okay, I think we're coming towards the end. I think there was a question from Tony Hausner that we've raised a lot of issues and concerns. What are our plans for addressing them? And maybe we can go through the panel one more time. What is the priorities for addressing these challenges that we've raised today? To conclude.
Oh, that's a very big question, but trying to summarize also, I would say that one important path that we need to follow is cooperation, and it's having the ability to create different frames for work in this field of Jewish heritage, engaging all the actors as possible. We had the pleasure with Ruth and Elise to share this session a couple of times, and I think that something that it's always in the top list is this need to, maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We need to look for these best practices. We need to make the actors to share their visions, and we need to share efforts and look for common solutions to share challenges and problems. I really believe that this is a very important way that we need to explore together. I will leave it here because we are running out of time, but if not, I will like to share a couple of examples in this regard.
Well, share one or two examples that are concrete.
Well, with Ruth, we've been able to participate and to follow a very interesting pan-European project called Rediscover. It's an alliance between Jewish communities and public bodies. And this is one of the most challenging things. And in 2 years, they achieved incredible results. And another one, it's a program that we are about to replicate, that started in Poland, and at least maybe can say a few words about it, called Midor Ledor. And I think it's one of the most innovative and original approaches to heritage and heritage education that it's going to be replicated in Italy with the help also of Ruth. So in this sense, I think that yes, again, this cooperation, especially in Europe, the transborder cooperation, it's becoming an essential or almost an obligation in order to do the things correctly.
Okay, Elise, any final thoughts?
Oh, many, they're never final, but thank you.
Including
They're ongoing process. My colleagues will. So very quickly, I think the strategy is education, but I think, and that education, Victor referred to Midor Lador, which is really a program of an educational program with heritage as a key core value. And I think one of our biggest challenges is making heritage a cool word. Heritage is cool. Heritage is a verb. You heritage, you have in Judaism, you have shamor v'zachor, you have Yerusha and Morasha, you have what you get and what you give. And we are all, in whatever form of heritage work we do, we're all in the middle. We're the transfer point. And how do we want to transfer it? To whom? And so I think one of the biggest challenges is making sure that heritage as a Jewish value is really inculcated in Jewish education or education, certainly in Jewish communities. And I would just add one more thing. I'm sorry, I just want to say, I was thinking about I always think about the first commandment about the synagogue. And I went on a holiday to Dubrovnik, and I decided that I wasn't going to do anything Jewish, nothing Jewish. And of course, where do I go first? The synagogue. Of course, I go to the synagogue. And at first I was struck, it's now a museum, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a kind of it's a nice old school museum, which means you can see things and they don't move around a lot. And I realized, wow, this is really a sad statement in the sense that what was once. And then I looked around and I thought, oh my God, all these people, many Jews from around the world, I heard so many different languages. And I realized that if we look at this as a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering, then it continues to have its sacred purpose. So.
At least it's not a discotheque, right? So
well, many places are thought through, and yeah. Anyway, Ruth.
Discotheque would be a place of gathering too. Anyhow, Ruth, why don't we leave it to you to conclude? Any final thoughts? Any messages you would like to give?
Well, I agree with, of course, Victor and Elise. I think cooperation and let's say networking is very important. And I think what's important is that people learn from each other. I find very often it's difficult for people who are working on a project to understand that what they're doing will be of interest or possibly of help to someone in another country or even in another city. I mean, this isn't unique for Jewish heritage work, because a lot of individual Jewish communities in their communal work don't cooperate or exchange information with others, and there's a lot of rivalry, of course. But I think exchanging information is extremely important. Learning from others is extremely important, and letting others know what you are doing is extremely important. I sometimes, in Krakow and Kazimierz, the old Jewish quarter, I sometimes, there's the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow, which takes place in the Jewish quarter. And there's another festival that takes place every year called 7 at Night, or the Night of the Synagogues. And I like to say Night of the Living Synagogues, to get in a little of that cinematic view. There are, besides this Beit Midrash, which is now a cafe, not a discotheque, it's a cafe, there are 7 synagogues in Kazimierz, all of which have been restored to one point or another. One's a museum, the old synagogue, the Gothic building, is a museum, Jewish museum, that's part of the city museum that's been operating since around 1960. There's the Remug Synagogue, which is used as a synagogue. It was built in 1551, something like that. There's the Kupa Synagogue, which is used sometimes for services, but also for cultural events. Popper Synagogue is now a bookstore, a Jewish bookstore. And Temple Synagogue is used, the Isaac Synagogue is used for services. Temple Synagogue is used also for services, but also as a concert venue. And in fact, the concerts can be really raucous during the Jewish Culture Festival and also during the 7 at Night. The 7 at Night program starts on Saturday night after Havdalah and lasts until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And each of these 7 synagogues have programs in them, and they can be rock concerts, they can be Jewish, living Jewish culture, living Jewish examples of contemporary Jewish culture. So you have photo exhibits, you have rock concerts, you have classical concerts, you have video shows, you have films and all of this, and people can go around to see these places into the wee hours. Well, the Temple Synagogue, which is built originally in 1862, was in bad shape, was restored in the 1990s with the help of the Polish government and Krakow municipality and World Monuments Fund. It's used as a concert venue as well as for services. And I have many pictures of the crowds at the concerts there. And, you know, there aren't many Jews, and there's a living Jewish community in Krakow now, and there's a very active JCC, and there's a Jewish preschool, and there's lots going on there. But when you know, they're still only a few hundred Jews there. And you go into the Temple Synagogue where there may be over 1,000 people, and they form the congregation. So it's the audience as the congregation. They are there. They're by and large not Jewish, but they are there in the synagogue participating in some sort of Jewish cultural activity. Unfortunately, a few years ago, you know, they were so raucous and jumped up and down so much at these klezmer and Jewish rock concerts and all of that the stability of the women's gallery, where a lot of people, you know, stayed, was really compromised, and they had to close it off. And, you know, we had a conference there, and the whole interior of the synagogue was, you know, remember, Elise, it was all scaffolded up. And but that shows that, you know, there's life there. And I don't like all the concerts that they have there. I like some of them very much, but, you know, it's this audience as the congregation, and it's using these buildings for culture as well as for worship, and finding the balance of how to do this in a respectful way, or in a way that acknowledges what these buildings are or were and what this history was, is important. And I have to say, there are some synagogues that have been turned into cafes or whatever that do this in a real way. There's one in Trnava in Slovakia, where the one synagogue is a contemporary art gallery, and across the street there's a synagogue that first was turned into a photographic gallery, which went bust, and then it was taken over by a cafe. It's called the Synagogue Cafe. The restoration is impeccable. It's sensitive. They tell the story of the synagogue there, and it's respectful. It's not denigrating it. It's not, you know, smashing it. It's not saying, oh, we thumb our nose at. No, it looks at this building as it was a synagogue. It's a former synagogue. It's not holy in itself. It's a former synagogue, but the history is important. And so this, I think they do a pretty good job, or at least last time I was there, they were doing a pretty good job of telling the story, but using it in a different way. Adaptive reuse, it's called. So, you know, respect the history, respect the building, respect the people, and learn from it. I think this is all part of life. This is all part of today's life. And that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Elise. Ruth, I hope I can go to some of those concerts soon in Krakow, that COVID will subside and we get back to definitely, I agree with you, an empty synagogue isn't very nice, but one with 1,000 people enjoying and learning and participating, I think is. And so thank you for taking the time on a Sunday to join our community around the world. And we look forward to having the next webinar in June. We'll be back to you with the notification of it. And I look forward to hearing your comments. Please send to Jesse any comments you have about the webinar or about this particular session. We'll pass them on to Ruth, Victor, and Helise. And thank you again and have a very good evening, Sunday evening, or Sunday afternoon if you're somewhere else in the United States joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to the good friend Jesse also.
Yeah, thanks to Jesse, Director Jesse.
Thank you. Bye-bye.